Chapter 28 The Return of Marshal Fane. December 1856. James brought in all the firewood and stacked it along the back wall before the snow drifted so high that they couldn't open the door. Snow covered the ice in the windows. It was eerie not to be able to see out, even in broad daylight. They were cut off, sealed in, but inside it was warm, and Miss Lisbeth looked after James and Solomon, and there was a feeling of making do, like camping by a river, and it wasn't so bad. 2 days passed before the storm stopped raging, enough for James to shovel a path to their door, in case Bob was trying to get home. Trembles wouldn't even poke his head out the door. Solomon grew stronger and was sitting up at the table after 4 days of Miss Lisbeth's care and cooking. James had scooped himself up some rabbit stew. His vegetarian days had passed quickly when he heard the crunching of boots on the snow. James opened the door on a glorious day, deceptively sunny, but still bitter cold, and came Pa up the front steps. James rushed up to him, but stopped just short of throwing his arms around him. "Lord, it's good to see thee, son." Pa pulled him close. Everything about him was cold, his rough coat, his rough beard, which James had thought he might never feel against his skin again. And then he gripped with the horrifying thought, Miss Lisbeth. "Good day, Mr. Weaver," Miss Lisbeth said, while she fed Solomon spoonfuls of her chicken broth. Solomon lifted his heavy head and managed a weak, "Welcome home, Mr. Weaver." Pa looked them both over, was silent for a good long minute while he prayed and thought it through, and finally he said, "Thee's been most helpful." "That's true, Mr. Weaver, because Solomon needed more than the boy could provide, and I suspect you could use a good hot meal yourself." She hurried to the stove to ladle out some stew for Pa. "Thank thee kindly," Pa said, while James paced the room, searching for some way to explain just who Miss Lisbeth was. Pa yanked his boots off and kneeled on Solomon's bed, warming his hands over the fire. Miss Lisbeth stood behind him with the dinner plate in her hand. "I trust you're Mrs. Weaver's handiwork?" he asked. "Yes, sir," Pa sighed. "But it's not her fault, Mr. Weaver, or your boy James's either. I just kept coming back and wouldn't leave." Pa slid his hands back and forth until his dry skin made a near screeching sound. Miss Lisbeth, Solomon, James, all of them held their breath until Pa said, "Thee's welcome here." James was giddy with relief. "Her name's Lisbeth Charles, Pa. We didn't mean to keep it from thee. Honest, we just—" Pa waved his words away. "Thy mother is a resolute woman. The day we married, she swore to love and honor, but not to obey." Pa got to his feet and took the dinner plate from Miss Lisbeth. He fingered a bit of butter off the top of the cornbread before it all melted in. He put his plate down and straddled the chair across from Solomon while they all waited. "But we shall have to be discreet, Miss Lisbeth Charles. Now, have thee said grace?" By the 10th of December, the snow was packed into thick bales in the drifts, but the roads were fairly clear for travel and brought Marshal Fane back. It was just luck that Miss Lisbeth was down in the cellar when he arrived, and had the good sense to stay there when she heard voices. Marshal Fane stood in the doorway waiting to be asked in. No one asked. Trembles arched his back and stared the marshal down. Finally, Pa said, "Well, it's cold. Thee might at least close the door behind thee. What brings thee here?" "Just checking to see how you weathered the storm, Mr. Weaver." "Well, as to be expected." Marshal Fane looked around the room, inspecting. "The wife back yet?" "We expect her as soon as the weather clears up." The marshal tapped the toe of his boot on the floor until Pa had no choice but to direct him to sit down. Solomon quickly left the table, knowing the marshal wouldn't sit there with him. "Who's this, Mr. Weaver?" "Now, thee knows who this is, Mr. Fane. Don't toy with us." The marshal squinted toward Solomon. "I don't believe I've seen this individual before." "Yes, sir, you have, Marshal, last time you were here," James said. "You studied his papers. He's Solomon Jefferson, a free man, remember?" "Well, now, I make a lot of stops on my circuit. Could be I remember, could be I don't. You got those papers with you, boy?" "No, sir," Solomon said, his jaws clenched. Marshal Fane looked around the room. "It's looking mighty orderly for a place where these three men's hold up in the winter. Hot pot of coffee on the stove. Pot of something tangy steaming. Sure smells good. My son James has become quite a cook since his mother's been gone," Pa said, with a twinkle in his eye. James smiled to himself, then took the cue and lifted the lid in the pot boiling in the stove, swirling the stringy gray stuff around with Ma's big pewtered ladle. About done, James said, though it might have needed 40 more hours to cook, for all he knew. Nice lacy dollies on the table. Sure looks like a woman's touch, said Marshal Fane. Thee might get to the point, friend. Well, Mr. Weaver, folks say there's a negro woman in and out of here. Folks saw her come in not long ago, never saw her go out. James stole a glance at Solomon, and both of them stood frozen in place. Pa stood up and loomed over the marshal. I have no use for thy accusation, sir, and I would appreciate thy vacating my home. Pa's voice was calm, but James read the anger soaring through him. Marshal Fane just crossed his ankle over his knee, as if he planned to stay a good long while. What would Will's pa or Jeremy's pa do at a time like this? Probably chase the marshal with a gun, fire at his toes while he hot-footed down the front steps. I do not lose my temper easily, Pa said, but thee is provoking me. Pa snatched off the marshal's hat with the showy badge on it. A gentleman takes off his hat indoors, sir. He threw his hat down on the chair and sat on it. James could barely keep from laughing, especially when he thought of the joke that used to go around the meeting house in Boston. A burglar breaks into a friend's house and the pa catches a burglar red-handed. He grabs a hunting rifle and aims it at the man. Well, the burglar's not expecting this, says, You don't scare me a bit. I know Quaker would never shoot a man. And the pa replies, I have no intention of harming thee, friend, but thee's standing where I aim to shoot. James was remembering how all the men and boys used to laugh over this joke when Marshal Fane turned pure mean. I'm warning you, Caleb Weaver. I'll get you for hiding runaway Negroes. All I need's proof. And I'll get that. My men will be watching here night and day, and will arrest you and any darky that goes in or out your door. In or out, Mr. Caleb Weaver. Night or day, you hear? He got up abruptly and strode to the door. Outside, James spotted a posse of the meanest, dirtiest-looking border ruffians, sporting no telling what kind of guns, and all of them blowing into their hands to keep warm. These were the kinds of men Will Bowers was out hunting down.